At 18, she was forced to marry a sickly duke, but on wedding night, he revealed why he chose her. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. On the edge of a small town where the paved road turned to packed dirt, the Hart house sat under a gray winter sky. Once, its white paint had been bright, and its porch full of laughter. Now the paint peeled, the porch board sagged, and the chill inside felt sharper than the wind outside. The fire in the living room fireplace had burned down to a tired glow, doing more to cast shadows than to give warmth. Evelyn Hart stood near the window, her fingers resting on the frayed curtain, watching a pair of strangers argue with her father at the front gate. Even from inside, she could hear the edge in their voices, the way they spoke his name like a warning and a verdict all at once. Mr. Hart, who had once walked into courtrooms with steady shoulders and a sure voice, now kept his head slightly bowed as he faced the men demanding payment he did not have. Evelyn's mother hovered near the door, wringing the edge of her apron, whispering the same sentence over and over as if it might change something. They said they'd come back with papers. Real papers, this time. Evelyn turned away from the window when the front door opened. Her father stepped inside, the cold following him, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and old tobacco from the men outside. His coat was too thin for the season, and his eyes seemed older than his face. "They've given me until the end of the week," he said quietly. "After that, they'll take the house." For a moment, no one spoke. The ticking of the old clock on the mantel sounded too loud in the silence. Evelyn felt her chest tighten, but her face remained calm. She had learned, over the last few years, that panic never changed the numbers on a page or the words in a contract. Before she could answer, there was another knock at the door, softer, more controlled, like someone who expected to be obeyed. Mr. Hart's expression shifted from defeat to wary confusion. When he opened the door, a man in a dark overcoat stepped in, brushing snow from his shoulders. Behind him, a carriage with polished wheels waited by the gate, its lanterns lit despite the afternoon light. The stranger removed his gloves slowly and handed Mr. Hart an envelope stamped with a black wax seal. The crest pressed into the wax was unmistakable even to Evelyn, who had only ever seen it in newspapers, a raven with outstretched wings above a shield. Blackwood. Her father's hands trembled as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Evelyn watched the color drain from his face as his eyes ran down the page. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing not just his daughter but the only bargaining chip left to him. "Evelyn," he said, his voice rough, "this is an offer." He swallowed hard. "The Duke of Blackwood proposes marriage. To you." The words hung in the air like a bell toll that would not stop ringing. Evelyn blinked once, slowly. The Duke of Blackwood was a name wrapped in rumors. Wealthy beyond measure, sickly, rarely seen in public, a man people spoke of in lowered voices. Why would such a man choose a girl who owned nothing but her name and a handful of worn dresses? "What does he want in return?" she asked, her voice steady. Mr. Hart lifted the letter again, as if hoping the words had changed. "He'll clear every debt," he whispered. "The house, the loans, everything. But the marriage must be immediate. No delays." Her mother pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes filling with tears. "Evelyn, you don't have to. We don't have another way," her father cut in, guilt weighing on each word. Evelyn felt the floor under her feet, the small rug worn thin where she always stood to read by the window, the faint warmth of the dying fire at her back. If she refused, the house would be taken, her parents would be turned out with nowhere to go. If she agreed, she would become the wife of a stranger everyone believed was too weak to live long. She did not weep. She did not collapse into a chair or beg for more time. Instead, she lifted her chin, looked at the black seal still gleaming on the broken envelope, and understood that her life had already been pushed to this edge long before the letter arrived. "Show me where to sign," she said softly. "If I am to become the Duchess of Blackwood, I should at least know how my name will look on the page." The paper was spread out on the dining table, pushed between the chipped plates and a stack of unpaid bills that no one had bothered to move. The man from Blackwood stood to one side with his hands folded neatly over the top of his cane, his expression calm in a way that made Evelyn feel as if everything had already been decided long before she spoke. Mr. Hart pointed to the line near the bottom of the page, where her name had been written in careful ink, waiting for her to trace over it. The pen felt heavier than it should have when she took it. For a second, the nib hovered above the paper, catching a flicker of afternoon light from the small window. Then she lowered it and signed, each letter steady, as if she could anchor herself by how clearly she wrote her own name. When it was done, the man from Blackwood nodded once, took the paper, and slipped it back into the envelope with the black seal. "The carriage will arrive by evening," he said. "You will be taken directly to Blackwood Manor. Everything you require will be provided there." It sounded less like a promise and more like a sentence. By the time the sun began to slide behind the line of trees at the edge of town, the carriage appeared exactly as he had said. Its black paint caught the fading light, the same raven crest gleaming on the door. The horses were well fed, their coats glossy, out of place in front of the Tired Heart house. Neighbors watched from their windows as trunks were lifted, though there were not many. Evelyn did not own much. She chose only what mattered: a worn book, a shawl her mother had stitched, a small locket with a faded photograph inside. Her mother held her a little longer than necessary at the door, but there were no dramatic speeches, no pleas to stay. They all understood there was nowhere for her to stay if she did not go. On the porch, Mr. Hart cleared his throat. "You will be all right," he said, trying to sound certain for her sake. "A duchess has influence. You will find a way to build a life there." Evelyn gave him a small, quiet smile. "I will do what needs to be done," she answered. She stepped into the carriage, the interior lined with dark fabric that smelled faintly of leather and something sharper, like herbs. The door closed with a firm sound, and through the small window, she watched her parents become smaller and smaller as the horses pulled her away from the house that had held every memory she knew. The road out of town turned rough quickly, the wheels bumping over stones and ruts. Bare trees reached toward the sky, their branches like dark ink strokes against the pale clouds. The temperature dropped as they climbed into higher ground, and a light dusting of snow began to fall, soft against the glass. At one point, the carriage slowed and rocked to one side. Evelyn braced her hand against the wall as the horses snorted and shuffled nervously. For a heartbeat, she felt the right will slide too close to the edge of the narrow road. Then she heard another set of hooves, the clear sound of a second horse approaching. The carriage steadied abruptly, the tension in the harness easing. Through the frosted window, she saw the brief outline of a rider in a dark coat, the flash of a white-gloved hand at the lead horse's bridle, and the quick, efficient movement of someone who knew these roads well. She could not see his face clearly, only the impression of height and control, and then he was gone, the carriage rolling forward as if nothing had happened. The driver called back, a little shaken but trying to sound casual. "Road shifts after a storm, my lady. Someone from the estate must have seen us from the ridge." The words, "my lady," sat strangely on her shoulders, like a coat that did not yet fit. Night had fully settled by the time the carriage passed through tall iron gates. The lantern light showed the Blackwood crest again on the metal, and beyond it, the long drive that led to the manor. The building emerged from the darkness slowly, window by window, like a great stone animal waking up. High walls, narrow panes of glass, chimneys sending thin ribbons of smoke into the cold air. The carriage stopped under a covered entryway. The door opened, and a wave of colder air brushed her face, carrying the scent of stone, wax, and something older that had seeped into the walls over generations. A man with silver at his temples and a straight back waited at the foot of the steps. His suit was simple but perfectly kept, his gloved hands folded in front of him. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor, Duchess," he said with a slight bow. "I am Hale, the house steward. His Grace is expecting you." Evelyn stepped down from the carriage, the hem of her dress brushing against the polished stone. The titles sounded unfamiliar, but she inclined her head with the quiet composure she had learned to carry like armor. Inside, the entry hall rose higher than any room she had ever seen, lit by a chandelier that sprinkled light over portraits in heavy frames. Faces of men and women long gone watched her from the walls, each brushstroke capturing pride, duty, or something that looked a great deal like loneliness. Hale moved with smooth precision beside her, his voice low. His Grace is in the study. He has not been well enough to travel, so he asked that your introduction be here in the house. The reminder of the Duke's condition, of the reason everyone whispered his name, settled like a shadow over her thoughts. Evelyn drew a slow breath, feeling the cool air slide into her chest. Whatever waited at the end of this corridor, she had already chosen to walk toward it when she set her name in ink. Now, she simply kept going as Hale opened a final door and announced her into the room where Adrian Blackwood waited. Hale stepped aside and Evelyn crossed the threshold into the study, aware of the quiet weight of every footstep on the dark wood floor. The room was lit by a pair of tall candles and a low fire. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and ledgers, and a large desk stood near the window where night pressed against the glass. Behind the desk, in a high-backed chair, sat Adrian Blackwood. He was not as old as the rumors had made him in her mind, but his illness was written plainly in the angles of his face and the way his shoulders leaned slightly toward the chair for support. His hair was dark, threaded lightly with silver at the temples. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the candlelight, and there was a faint hollowness beneath his eyes, like someone who had not truly rested in a long time. Still, his gaze was clear when it met hers, sharp and assessing, as if he weighed not just her appearance but her composure, her silence, the way she held her chin level despite the strangeness of the moment. For a second, neither of them spoke. The crackle of the fire filled the space between them. Then he set aside the glass of water near his hand and rose carefully, using a dark cane more as reassurance than necessity. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice low, carrying the trace of fatigue but not weakness. "Or perhaps I should say Duchess, though the church has not yet spoken the words." Evelyn inclined her head. "Evelyn will do, Your Grace." A flicker of something unreadable moved through his expression, gone before she could name it. He gestured toward a chair near the fire. "Please sit. I imagine this is not the future you dreamed of when you were a child in that town." She sat, smoothing her skirt carefully. "Dreams tend to change when debts arrive, Your Grace." It was not a complaint, merely a fact, and that seemed to catch his attention more than any tearful protest might have. He studied her a moment longer. "You understand the terms that were given to your father. Your family's obligations are now settled. In return, you will become the Duchess of Blackwood. The ceremony will take place tomorrow at the chapel on the estate grounds. I am not able to travel far, so it will be concise." The pause before that last word told her he understood how stark it sounded, a life bound and changed in a matter of minutes. "I understand," she replied. "May I ask only one question, Your Grace?" He nodded once. "Why me?" she asked. "There are many families who would offer their daughters willingly for your name and your land. My family came to you with nothing but debt and a house that is almost empty." For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "There will be time for that answer," he said. "For now, you should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day, even if the ceremony itself is short." It was not the explanation she wanted, but there was a finality in his tone that told her he would say no more tonight. Hale appeared again and led her to a room on the second floor, its window looking out over a courtyard and a stand of dark trees. The bed was larger than any she had slept in, the linens smooth and cool to the touch. Hanging near the wardrobe was a gown of soft ivory fabric, simple but finely made, clearly fitted in haste to approximate her measurements. She ran her hand over the material once, then let it fall. Morning came wrapped in a pale mist. Bells rang from the small stone chapel on the edge of the grounds, their sound carrying across the estate. Evelyn walked up the path between rows of bare shrubs, the damp air cool against her face. A few townspeople had been invited, more to witness than to celebrate. She could feel their eyes on her, the way whispers followed her steps. "That must be her," someone murmured. "The girl whose father owed more than he could ever pay. They say the Duke can barely stand." Another voice replied softly. "Perhaps he wished to settle accounts before he is gone." Evelyn did not quicken her pace or lower her head. At the chapel door, a woman in a dark gown greeted her with a tight, assessing smile. "Lady Beatrice Blackwood," Hale murmured at Evelyn's side. "His Grace's aunt." Lady Beatrice's gaze took in every detail of Evelyn's dress, her gloves, the way she carried herself. "You are younger than I expected," she said. "But I suppose necessity does not always wait for the perfect match." The words were smooth, but there was an edge underneath that Evelyn felt like a draft through a closed window. Inside the chapel, candles burned along the walls, their flames steady in the still air. Adrian stood at the front, near the simple altar, dressed in black with a white shirt that emphasized the pallor of his skin. He leaned very slightly on his cane, but when Evelyn's footsteps echoed on the stone floor, he straightened as if he refused to let anyone see how much he relied on it. Beside him stood a man younger, broader in the shoulders, with a polished charm in his posture. His eyes, however, held a glint that did not match the polite smile on his face. "Lord Marcus Blackwood," Hale whispered. "His Grace's cousin." Marcus bowed over Evelyn's hand with practiced ease. "Cousin by marriage, very soon," he said. "Welcome to the family, Lady Evelyn." The way he said family sounded less like comfort and more like a test. The ceremony began, the minister's words rising and falling in measured cadence. When it was time to speak her vows, Evelyn's voice was clear, echoing softly off stone. When Adrian answered in turn, a faint roughness caught in his throat, but he completed every line without faltering. As the final blessing was given, she felt the invisible line of her life shift. When they turned to face the small gathering, she felt the weight of the Blackwood name settle beside her own, heavy and unyielding. Somewhere in the back of the chapel, she caught Hale's steady gaze, not warm exactly, but solid, as if he were silently acknowledging that he had seen many such moments, and that this one would matter more than most. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, a modest reception had been arranged in one of the manor's halls. Music played softly from a corner, and servants moved quietly with trays of food and glasses. Evelyn stood at Adrian's side, every polite word and measured gesture shaping her into the role she had agreed to fill, even as a single question remained unanswered in the quietest part of her mind. Why had this man, frail and feared, chosen her from all the people in the world? The reception blurred into a series of faces and voices that did not quite reach Evelyn, as if she were standing behind a pane of glass. People approached to offer polite congratulations, their words smooth while their eyes measured her, weighing rumor against reality. Lady Beatrice made small talk that felt like delicate needles, asking about the town where Evelyn had grown up, about her parents, about how strange it must be to manage a household of this size. Lord Marcus drifted in and out of the circle around them, his laughter a little too loud, his compliments edged with curiosity. At one point he lifted his glass and said, "To His Grace and his new bride. May this union bring stability and comfort to Blackwood." The pause before the word comfort made it sound like a replacement for something else he chose not to say out loud. Adrian responded with a small, courteous nod, but Evelyn felt the line of his shoulders tighten almost imperceptibly. When the last of the guests began to leave, and the hall finally emptied of music and murmur, the house seemed to exhale. The candles burned lower, casting longer shadows along the walls. Hale approached with unobtrusive calm. "The West Wing room has been prepared, Your Grace," he said quietly to Adrian, but his eyes flicked once toward Evelyn, respectful and careful at the same time. Adrian inclined his head. "Thank you, Hale. That will be all for tonight." As they left the hall together, the silence between them felt different now that there were no spectators. Their footsteps echoed along the corridor, past tall windows that showed only darkness and the faint outline of trees against the sky. Evelyn could feel her heart beat a little too clearly, not from romance, but from the weight of expectation. Stories drifted through any town about what happened on a wedding night, some whispered with giggles, others spoken with a kind of wary sympathy. She had never imagined herself in one of those stories, yet here she was, walking beside a man she barely knew toward a room that would be theirs in the eyes of the world. At the door, Adrian paused before opening it. "Evelyn," he said quietly, his hand on the handle, "before you step inside, allow me to make one thing clear." She looked up at him, steady despite the questions pressing at the back of her thoughts. "You are safe here," he continued. "Whatever expectations others may have, I will not demand anything from you that you do not freely offer. This marriage is already a heavy enough bargain for you, without fear added to it. Some of the tightness in her chest eased, though she kept her expression calm. Thank you, Your Grace, she said. He opened the door, and they entered the room. A fire burned in the hearth, throwing a gentle warmth over the carved bedposts and the soft rug underfoot. 2 chairs sat near the fire with a small table between them, holding a carafe of water and 2 glasses. On the far side, a screen stood ready, offering privacy to change. Adrian moved to the table, poured water into 1 glass, then another. Instead of handing one to her first, he lifted his own and took a small sip as if to demonstrate something without calling attention to it. Only then did he offer her the second glass. Please sit, he said, taking the chair opposite her. You asked me a question earlier. I told you there would be time for an answer. This is that time. The firelight traced the lines of his face, softening the sharpness without hiding the strain around his eyes. You asked why I chose you, he said. Evelyn folded her hands in her lap, the cool of the glass resting against her fingers. Yes, Your Grace. He looked at the flames for a long, quiet moment before he spoke again. Several years ago, I was in your town, he began. I was not yet as limited by illness as I am now. I was traveling under another name, staying at the inn near the square. One morning, there was a commotion in the street. A stable boy had been accused of taking a coin purse from a gentleman. People gathered. Words became harsh very quickly. Evelyn tried to remember. There had been many small scenes of unfairness in that town, most of which people ignored in order to avoid trouble. I recall voices, she said slowly. Many times. Adrian nodded. On that particular morning, the man accusing the boy was well-dressed, loud, and very sure of his own importance. No one wanted to challenge him. No one, except a girl with ink on her fingers and dust on her hem, who stepped between him and the boy and said she had seen the purse fall from his own pocket. The memory came back into focus then, not as a story but as the sharp image of bright sunlight on cobblestones, a frightened boy, and the way her own voice had shaken but not stopped. She had forgotten that anyone might have been watching. You took the boy's side, Adrian said. You risked your own safety, and that of your family's reputation, to contradict a man who could have made life very unpleasant for you. You had nothing to gain. You did it anyway. He turned his gaze fully on her. I had been surrounded my whole life by people who calculated every move, every word, based on advantage. That morning was the first time in a very long time that I saw someone act out of conviction alone. Evelyn felt warmth rise to her cheeks, not from modesty, but from the strange intimacy of being remembered for a moment she had never spoken of to anyone. That was a very small thing, she said quietly. Not to me, he replied. When my health began to fail, when treatments that were meant to help left me weaker, I began to realize that if something was wrong, it was happening very close to me. In this house, perhaps within my own circle. I could not trust anyone whose future depended on my absence. I decided that if I was to bind my life and my estate to someone, it had to be a person who had already proven that truth mattered more to them than comfort. He paused, his voice softening. When I learned your family was drowning in debt, I did not see an opportunity to purchase a bride. I saw a way to offer you a door out of a closing room, if you were willing to walk through it. And in return I would gain an ally who does not scare easily when power behaves badly. Evelyn looked at him across the small space between their chairs, the fire painting gold along the edge of his profile. The questions in her mind did not all vanish, but they shifted, rearranged by the knowledge that she had not been chosen at random or simply as a convenient sacrifice. So you did not save me out of kindness alone, she said at last. You needed someone who would stand beside you when the truth becomes uncomfortable. Yes, he answered, without apology. And because I am very tired of being surrounded by people who only speak when it serves them. I would rather share this house with someone who once stood in the dust of a market square and told a man twice her size that he was wrong. The corner of her mouth lifted, just slightly. Then I will. Try not to disappoint you, Your Grace. He inclined his head, and for the first time that day, the silence between them did not feel like a wall, but like a space that might, in time, be carefully crossed. Morning light found its way into the room through a narrow gap in the curtains, painting a pale stripe across the floorboards. Evelyn woke to the quiet sound of the manor breathing around her, distant footsteps in the hallway, the faint clatter of dishes far below. The events of the previous day settled slowly into place in her mind. The vows, the reception, the conversation by the fire where Adrian had taken apart the mystery of her own past and shown her why he had reached for her name. She dressed and stepped into the corridor, finding Hale already waiting with the calm efficiency of someone who had long since learned to anticipate the household's needs. "Good morning, Duchess," he said with a respectful nod. His Grace usually takes breakfast in the study. Dr. Collins is scheduled to call within the hour. The name was new to her. "Dr. Collins?" she asked. "The physician who oversees His Grace's treatment," Hale replied. "He has been attending him for some time." The way he said it was neutral, but Evelyn heard a faint weariness beneath the words, as if the story of those treatments had been told too many times without bringing the relief everyone hoped for. In the study, Adrian sat near the window with a cup of tea untouched at his elbow and a small stack of papers in front of him. He looked tired, but there was a certain alertness in his eyes that had not been there when she first saw him from across the chapel. "You are up early," he observed as she entered. "The house will approve. It likes people who rise with the sun." She allowed herself a small smile. "Then I will try to stay on its good side." Before they could say more, there was a knock at the door and Hale ushered in a man with a neat beard, a carefully pressed dark coat, and a medical bag carried as if it were a badge of authority. "Your Grace," the man said with polished ease. "Duchess, an honor." His eyes moved over Evelyn quickly, cataloging her like a new item in the room. Then returned to Adrian with professional concern. "How was your rest? Any difficulty breathing? Any new discomfort?" Adrian answered each question patiently, as if he had done so many times before. Dr. Collins set several bottles on the desk, their glass catching the light. The liquids inside were various shades of amber and pale gold. Evelyn watched as he measured careful doses, adding a few drops from one bottle into another with the precision of a man who believed entirely in his own methods. "These formulations have kept your condition stable," he reminded Adrian in a practiced tone. "We must not disrupt what little balance we have." Evelyn did not interrupt, but she watched closely, noting the way the doctor's gaze sharpened when Adrian hesitated before swallowing the mixture. After the doctor left, the room felt slightly heavier. For a short time, Adrian seemed no worse, but as the morning stretched toward midday, a new pallor crept into his face, and his hand shook faintly when he reached for his tea. At lunch, when he pushed his food away earlier than he should have, Evelyn studied him quietly. "Is it always like this after he visits?" she asked later, when they were alone in the corridor. Adrian considered his answer. "Sometimes it is better," he said. "Sometimes it is worse. It is difficult to measure when one is already unwell." His words were careful, but she heard the thin edge of frustration beneath them. That afternoon, Hale offered to show her more of the house. They walked along the main staircase, its railing polished smooth by years of use. Adrian joined them for part of the way, insisting on moving without assistance even when the exertion cost him. Halfway down, Evelyn's foot slid a fraction of an inch on a step that should have been solid. She caught herself quickly on the railing and automatically reached out her free hand toward Adrian. He had felt it too. His cane tapped sharply as he adjusted his balance. She glanced down and saw a faint sheen on the edge of the step, something that caught the light in a way plain would not. "It appears someone has been careless with polish," Hale said, noting her look. "I will have the staff attend to it." His explanation was reasonable, yet Evelyn felt a small knot form in her stomach. Carelessness on a staircase where the master of the house already moved unsteadily did not feel like a simple oversight. That evening, after the lamps were lit and the house had settled into its quieter rhythm, Evelyn found herself once more in the study. The bottles Dr. Collins had left stood in a neat row on a side table. Their labels were written in a tidy hand, filled with names she did not recognize. She picked one up, holding it to the light. The liquid inside moved slowly, thicker than water. "You are not required to learn the names of my medicines," Adrian's voice said from the doorway. She turned to see him leaning lightly against the frame, a faint humor in his expression. "A duchess has many duties. Reading the handwriting of physicians need not be one of them." "Perhaps not," she replied. "But it seems unwise for anyone in this house to ignore what you are given so often." He studied her, the silence between them longer this time. "There are days," he said finally, when I feel as though something in these bottles holds me in place rather than setting me free. I have no proof of that. Only an uncooperative body and a mind that has had too much time to think. Evelyn set the bottle down with deliberate care. Then until we know for certain, I will pay attention for both of us, she said. I did not come here only to wear a new title. If there is something in this house that means you harm, I intend to notice it. For a moment, the fatigue in his eyes lifted, replaced by something like gratitude, though he did not name it. You have a talent for making very simple promises sound rather formidable, he said quietly. Let us hope that is enough to unsettle those who would prefer us to look away. The fire hissed as a log shifted, sending up a small shower of sparks. In that gentle sound, Evelyn heard the first outline of a new understanding. This marriage was not just shelter from a debt. It was the beginning of a quiet watch, and she was now its most alert guardian. In the days that followed, the rhythm of Blackwood Manor began to reveal itself to Evelyn, not as a gentle pattern, but as a series of small repetitions that invited scrutiny. On the mornings when Dr. Collins came, Adrian began the day upright and composed, his voice measured as he greeted the physician. By late afternoon, his steps grew heavier, and there was a shadowed look around his eyes that had nothing to do with simple tiredness. On the quieter days between visits, when the bottles on the side table remained untouched, he seemed slightly stronger, able to walk the length of the hall without pausing to catch his breath. Evelyn did not announce these observations. She simply stored them away, each one another thread in a growing web of unease. One clear morning, as a thin winter sun managed to find its way through the clouds, Marcus appeared in the breakfast room with a smile that felt too bright for the muted light. The weather is as good as we can hope for this season, he said cheerfully. Cousin, you have been indoors too long. A short ride would do you good. Fresh air, a view of the grounds, a chance for the new duchess to see the estate beyond the windows. Adrian set down his cup with care. My strength is not what it was, he replied. But I suppose a brief ride would not be unwise, provided we stay on the lower paths. Marcus spread his hands in apparent agreement. Of course, only the gentlest slopes. It will reassure the tenants to see you out. Rumors grow when a man is seen only behind stone walls. His tone made the suggestion sound dutiful, even considerate. Evelyn felt a faint, instinctive resistance, but she understood the power of appearances. A duke who never left his house invited questions, and questions could be used by the wrong people. If we keep it short, she said, and if there is a carriage available should his grace need to return sooner than planned, I see no harm in it. Marcus laughed lightly. Practical. Very good. I will have the horses prepared. In the courtyard, the air was crisp and cool. Stable hands moved efficiently, saddling 3 horses. Evelyn watched as a groom adjusted the cinch on Adrian's mount, a calm, dark animal that clearly knew its master's pace. Marcus's horse shifted with more energy, as if reflecting his owner's restless temperament. Evelyn approached Adrian's horse, laying a hand lightly on its neck. The leather straps looked correct at a glance, but when she brushed her fingertips along the edge of the saddle, she felt a slight unevenness, a place where the surface did not match the rest. She did not have the expertise to know what it meant, only that it gave her pause. She glanced toward the stable doors and saw one of the younger grooms watching her with a nervous expression, as if hoping she would not look too closely. Before she could step away, Adrian was beside her, his gloved hand steady on the horse's bridle. If we are to do this, we should begin, he said quietly, as though he had sensed her hesitation but chosen to trust her judgment. She met his eyes for a moment. We will stay on the level ground, she reminded him. No galloping, no steep drops. You overestimate my energy, he answered with a faint curve of his mouth. The horse would leave me behind long before that. They set out at a gentle pace, the 3 of them moving along a broad path that curved around the gardens and out toward a low rise. The fields stretched away on either side, edged by stone walls and clusters of bare trees. For a time, the ride was almost pleasant. The air smelled clean, and the movement seemed to bring a small color back to Adrian's face. Marcus rode slightly ahead, pointing out sections of the estate, speaking of repairs that would be needed in the spring, of tenants who might require attention. Then he turned his horse toward a narrow track that sloped gently upward. Just to the ridge, he called back. The view of the valley is worth the effort, I promise. Evelyn's horse followed, and Adrian's did as well, obedient to the pressure of the reins. At first the incline was mild, but the earth under the thin layer of frost was softer than it appeared. About halfway up, the ground shifted slightly beneath the horse's hooves. Evelyn felt her mount adjust, muscles tensing. A heartbeat later, Adrian's horse gave a startled step sideways as the saddle slipped a fraction of an inch, enough to throw off his balance. He caught himself with both hands on the pommel, his cane already secured along the saddle, but for an instant the world tilted for him. Evelyn reacted without thinking. She guided her horse closer, reaching out to take hold of the bridle near the bit, steadying the animal with a firm, calm touch. The groom who had come along at Marcus's suggestion hurried up the slope, taking the other side. Between the three of them, horse and rider were brought back to an even stance. No one fell. No one was hurt. Yet the quiet that followed felt heavy, as if the landscape itself were holding its breath. That was careless, Evelyn said, her voice very even. The saddle was not secure. Marcus looked back over his shoulder, his expression a picture of surprised concern. The ground gave way, he said. It happens on these hills. We should not overthink a simple misstep. Adrian glanced down at the strap, his eyes narrowing slightly. Simple missteps can become serious when a man is not steady on his feet to begin with, he replied. We will return now. His tone allowed no argument. The ride back was shorter, the mood subdued. Once inside the relative safety of the manor, Evelyn asked Hale to join them in the study. The saddle strap, now removed, lay stretched across the desk. In the clearer light, the irregularity she had felt earlier was more visible. Near the buckle, the leather showed a thin, deliberate cut that had not yet traveled all the way through. It was the sort of mark that might escape notice during a quick inspection, but under strain, it would widen. Hale's face remained composed, but his jaw tightened. This should not look like this, he said quietly. I will find out who last handled it. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his fingers resting lightly on the armrests. Whoever did this was willing to let the rest of the work be completed by gravity, he said. He looked at Evelyn, and in his gaze she saw both apology and a strange relief. You were right to be suspicious. She did not feel triumphant. She felt colder than the air outside. If someone in this house is willing to risk an accident, she said, choosing the gentler word because the harder one would make the room feel smaller, then we can no longer assume anything is harmless. Not stairs, not saddles, not medicine. Adrian nodded slowly. Then we begin as we mean to go on, he replied, with our eyes open, and our trust given only where it is earned. Evelyn stood a little straighter, the role she had accepted now deeper than any title. She was no longer simply a debtor's daughter who had married into stone walls and old wealth. She was the one person in Blackwood Manor who had nothing to gain from his absence, and that made her presence more necessary than ever. The discovery of the damaged saddle changed something quiet but unmistakable in the air of Blackwood Manor. It was as if the house itself had shifted from uneasy sleep into full wakefulness, its shadows no longer simply dark corners, but places where eyes might be watching. Evelyn felt it most strongly the next time Dr. Collins arrived. He greeted Adrian with the same polished phrases, set his bag on the same small table, and arranged his bottles in the same precise order. Yet now, every movement seemed to carry a second meaning. Evelyn stood a little to the side, as if merely observing out of concern for her husband, while in reality she was counting drops, noting which bottle he reached for first, and memorizing the exact shade of the liquid that slid into the glass. When Dr. Collins turned toward Adrian, offering the mixed dose, Adrian paused and glanced at Evelyn. It was a very small hesitation, but it acknowledged her presence as something different than before. Still, he lifted the glass and drank as the physician watched. After the visit, the familiar pattern returned. Adrian's color faded, and by evening he was too tired to leave his chair. Evelyn sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea she had barely touched. In the lamplight, the bottles on the side table looked more like pieces on a game board than healing tools. If there was only one strange occurrence, I could blame misfortune, she said quietly. But we have a damaged saddle that should never have passed inspection, and medicine that seems to leave you weaker instead of stronger. That is too much chance for my liking. Adrian leaned his head back against the chair, his eyes half closed. If I accuse the physician without proof, I appear ungrateful at best and unstable at worst, he replied. There are those in this household who would be very glad to call my judgment into question. Evelyn looked at the nearest bottle, its label a careful line of ink. Then we need more than suspicion. She answered. We need someone outside this house to tell us what is in these mixtures. The next morning brought a pale sky and a thin layer of frost on the ground, the kind that made every step sound slightly louder than usual. Hale met Evelyn near the staircase, a ledger in hand. There are accounts that require your attention, Duchess, he said, but his eyes searched her face, as if he sensed a decision forming there. Later, she replied. I have an errand that cannot wait. I will need a horse saddled and no carriage. The town is not far, and I would prefer to be less easily noticed. Hale did not ask unnecessary questions. Very well, he said. There is a mare that is steady and not easily startled. I will have her ready near the side gate. As she turned to leave, he added in a lower tone, You may wish to avoid mentioning this outing to Lord Marcus or Lady Beatrice. They have their own ideas about how often you should be seen beyond these walls. In her room, Evelyn chose a darker dress and a cloak with a deep hood, the kind that would not draw attention on a town street. She slipped one of the smaller bottles of medicine into an inner pocket, wrapping it in a handkerchief so the glass would not clink. Her heart beat a little faster, but it was not the quick flutter of fear. It was the steady, measured rhythm of someone who knew she was stepping over a line that could not easily be uncrossed. At the side gate, the mare waited as promised, her breath misting in the cold air. A stable hand held the reins, eyes lowered with the respectful caution of someone who understood that whatever this ride was, it was not meant for gossip. Evelyn mounted and set off down the narrower path that led away from the main road, the manor slowly shrinking behind her. The town came into view after some time, its cluster of roofs and chimneys familiar, yet changed by the fact that she approached it now not as a resident, but as someone who had crossed into another world. She rode past the larger, newer pharmacy on the main street, and turned instead onto a side lane where the buildings leaned closer together. At the end of it stood a small shop with a faded sign and clean windows. Inside, shelves lined with jars and carefully labeled bottles filled the space with the faint, mixed aroma of herbs and tinctures. An older man looked up from behind the counter, his hair thinning, his eyes sharp. Good morning, ma'am, he said. You have the look of someone who has come with a question that will not leave you alone. Evelyn drew the wrapped bottle from her cloak and placed it gently on the counter. My husband has been taking this for some time, she said. It is meant to strengthen him, but after every dose he is weaker. I need to know if what is inside this bottle matches what its label claims. The man unwrapped the glass, turning it in his hands. He read the label, his brows drawing together. I know this name, he murmured. Dr. Collins. He trained in respectable places. That does not make him incapable of error. He gestured toward a door at the back. Wait here. This will take a little time. But if you have trusted yourself enough to bring this, I will honor that trust with an honest answer. As he disappeared into the back room, Evelyn stood very still, listening to the muted sounds of glass and metal, water and flame. Outside, a cart rolled past and a child laughed, ordinary sounds that felt strangely distant from the gravity of what she had set in motion. She knew that if the contents of that bottle were what they claimed to be, she would return to Blackwood Manor with nothing more than a story of her own suspicion. But if they were not, then the quiet, invisible battle that had begun with a damaged saddle and an uneasy pattern of illness was about to sharpen into something far more dangerous. When the apothecary returned, he carried the bottle with the same care she had used in bringing it to him. But there was a new weight in his expression, as if he had aged a little in the short time he had been in the back room. He set the bottle on the counter and placed a folded slip of paper beside it, the edges marked with his name and a small ink stamp. The label claims this is a restorative tonic, he said calmly. There are ingredients consistent with that. However, there is also an additional compound, in a measure that is small enough not to cause an immediate crisis, but large enough to cause a steady weakening if taken regularly. Evelyn felt her fingers tighten around the edge of the counter. You are certain? She asked. I have no reason to exaggerate, he replied. When used carefully and for a short time, this added element can be tolerated. When given as a long-term measure to someone already fragile, it erodes strength rather than building it. It might be explained as an error in judgment, but the proportions here are so consistent that it does not look like an accident to me. He tapped the folded paper. I have written my findings plainly. If anyone questions you, you are not relying on memory alone. She thanked him, aware that the words were too small for what he had just handed her. As she rode back toward Blackwood Manor, the sky had softened into the muted colors of late afternoon. The fields and stone walls passed in a blur. The bottle and the apothecary's note rested against her heart, a quiet proof that what she and Adrian had felt in their bones was not just a collection of worries. At the side gate, Hale was waiting, his presence as steady as the stone of the walls. You were seen leaving, he said in a low voice as he took the mare's reins. Lord Marcus asked after you. I told him you wished to become more familiar with the tenants, that you had gone to look over the boundary farms. It satisfied him for the moment. Evelyn slipped down from the saddle, her cloak still carrying the chill of the air outside. Thank you, she replied. Let us hope the truth travels more slowly than gossip today. In the study, Adrian was seated by the fire, a book open but unread in his lap. He looked up as she entered, and in the flicker of the firelight, she could see that the day's dose of medicine had already done its quiet work, leaving him more drawn, his energy blunted. She crossed the room and set the folded paper and the bottle on the small table beside him. I took this to an apothecary in town, she said. Someone with no stake in this house and no reason to flatter or insult us. He tested it. What he found is written there. Adrian unfolded the paper slowly, his eyes moving over the neat lines. With each sentence, the muscles along his jaw tightened. When he finished, he closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, the tiredness still there, but now joined by something sharper. So it is not only my imagination, he said quietly. Whatever Dr. Collins's intention, his treatment has held me in a narrow cage. Evelyn met his gaze. The apothecary believes the doses are too precise to be accidental. Whether this began as careless practice or something more deliberate, it has continued long enough to serve those who gain from your weakness. Before he could answer, a knock came at the study door. Hale stepped inside. Your Grace, Lady Beatrice has requested your presence in the Great Hall, he said. She wishes to discuss certain estate matters with you both. Lord Marcus and Dr. Collins are already there. The timing was too exact to feel like chance. Adrian rose with care, slipping the apothecary's note into his inner pocket and leaving the bottle on the table. Then we shall not keep them waiting, he said. The great hall was lit more brightly than usual, as if for a gathering. Lady Beatrice stood by the long table, her hands folded neatly. Marcus leaned against the back of a chair with practiced ease, while Dr. Collins waited at a respectful distance, his bag at his feet. We are all concerned for your health, Adrian. Lady Beatrice began, her tone warm on the surface. There has been talk among the tenants. They wonder whether the estate is prepared for every possibility. It might be wise to discuss the future openly. Marcus nodded with sympathetic gravity. Change comes to every family, he said. It is best when it is managed with clear heads and steady hands. Evelyn felt the shape of their intentions as clearly as if they had laid them out on the table between them. They wanted Adrian to accept a smaller role, to let others guide decisions while he faded quietly into the background. Adrian glanced at her, and in that brief look she saw not only weariness, but choice. He turned back to the others. Before we speak of the future, he said, we should understand the present. Dr. Collins, would you mind explaining the exact nature of the tonic you have been administering to me? The physician straightened slightly. Of course, Your Grace. It is a restorative blend, carefully balanced to support your system. Every element is selected to strengthen you. Adrian's hand went to his pocket. That is interesting, he said, his voice still calm. Because an independent apothecary in town has examined a recent bottle and found an additional compound that appears to do the opposite when taken over time. He has documented his findings here. The hall fell very still. Evelyn watched Dr. Collins closely. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face before he composed himself. There must be some misunderstanding, he began. Mixtures can be interpreted differently by those not familiar with the full method. Marcus stepped forward quickly, his expression a mix of concern and injured pride. Adrian, You cannot seriously place more trust in some shopkeeper than in the physician who has attended you for years. Your new wife has a sharp mind, but she is young and perhaps overly alarmed by things she does not yet understand. Evelyn did not flinch. The man in town may have a fated sign, she said evenly, but he has no inheritance tied to your cousin's condition. He has no reason to hope that his grace remains unwell. Adrian lifted a hand, and the room quieted. When he spoke, his voice did not rise, but there was a firmness in it that had been missing in recent months. Until I have a complete review of every prescription that has been given to me, you will suspend all further treatment, Dr. Collins, he said. You will leave your records here for inspection. Hale will secure the medicine. From this moment, no one administers anything to me without my explicit consent and without my wife's knowledge. Lady Beatrice's lips parted in polite protest, but she did not interrupt. Dr. Collins inclined his head stiffly, his composure strained. Marcus's jaw tightened, a crack in his easy charm. Evelyn stood at Adrian's side, hearing in his words the first clear line drawn in a house that had grown used to quiet compliance. The battle had not ended. It had only shifted into the open. But for the first time, they were no longer two separate targets in the dark. They were standing together. In the days that followed the confrontation in the great hall, the atmosphere in Blackwood Manor felt different, as if the very stones had leaned in to listen. Dr. Collins spent one tense morning in the study with Adrian and Hale, turning over his notes, his methods, and his well-practiced explanations. Evelyn remained nearby, not interrupting often, but asking questions that made it impossible for him to hide behind complicated terms. When the physician finally left, it was with his bag in hand, and an understanding that he would not be returning until a second opinion was brought in. Word traveled quickly, as it always did, but this time the whispers carried a new tone. People spoke not only of a sickly duke, but of a duchess who had ridden into town with a bottle of medicine and come back with proof that something was terribly wrong. A new doctor arrived from the city, recommended by a friend of Hale's who owed him an old favor. He was careful, methodical, and not easily impressed by reputation. He reviewed every prescription, every mixture, and came to the same quiet conclusion the apothecary had reached. Your body has been fighting the very thing it was given to restore it, he told Adrian. Now that we have removed the harmful element, improvement will not be immediate, but it will be possible. The word possible felt like a window opening a fraction of an inch in a room that had been closed for too long. Marcus came to Adrian privately one evening, the charm in his smile frayed at the edges. This has all gone further than it needed to, he said. You have embarrassed a respected physician. You risk shaking the tenant's confidence. If you would simply allow me to manage the more demanding parts of the estate while you recover, everyone would be reassured. Adrian listened, then answered with a steadiness that surprised even himself. You speak as if this house were waiting for my absence, he said. It will have to wait longer. The estate will be managed, but not by someone who benefits from my decline. Marcus's eyes hardened for a moment before he masked it with a polite nod. Very well, he said. If you insist on carrying this burden, do not say I did not offer to help. Lady Beatrice watched the shifting tides with the practiced eye of someone who had survived more than one change. In fortune, she did not defend Dr. Collins openly, nor did she argue loudly with Adrian's choices. Instead, she requested a smaller house in the nearby town, explaining with a gentle sigh that her nerves were no longer suited to the strain of a household in turmoil. When she departed, she did so with her head high and her trunks full, the echo of her measured footsteps fading down the front steps that had once seemed to belong as much to her as to anyone. Winter softened its hold by slow degrees. Snow melted from the edges of the stone paths, and thin green shoots began to appear in sheltered corners of the garden. Adrian's progress was similar. There were days when he was still pale and tired, but there were also mornings when he walked the length of the corridor with only his cane for balance and did not have to stop to catch his breath. On those mornings, Hale's expression eased, though he tried to hide it, and the staff moved with a lighter step. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills and left the sky glowing faintly, Evelyn found Adrian in the small library at the back of the manor. He was standing, one hand resting on the back of a chair, looking out at the courtyard where the first signs of spring were beginning to touch the stone. I received a letter today, he said as she joined him. From a solicitor in town. He wished to confirm that my most recent instructions regarding the estate are to remain in force. Evelyn glanced toward the desk, where a neat stack of papers lay. You mean the instructions that ensure Blackwood Manor does not pass easily into the hands of a cousin who cannot tell the difference between concern and ambition, she said. He allowed himself a small smile. Those would be the ones. They are now properly witnessed and filed. If anything should happen to me, the estate will be held in trust under your authority until such time as there is another rightful heir or another arrangement of your choosing. The thought of such a responsibility might have seemed overwhelming once, back when she stood in a faded house at the edge of town with a pen in her hand and a debt hanging over her family. Now it felt like an extension of what she was already doing every day. You have given me a great deal of power, Adrian, she said quietly. Power follows the person who can be trusted with it, he replied. I saw that in you long before you knew I existed. I am only putting into ink what I have already believed in practice. Outside, a chill breeze moved a loose branch against the window, tapping softly. Evelyn looked at Adrian, taking in the lines of his face, still marked by illness but no longer resigned to it. When I was brought here, she said, I thought I had been purchased to solve a problem. My family's debt was cleared, and in exchange I was placed inside these walls as if on a shelf. I did not expect that you would tell me you chose me because I had once stood in the dust and refused to look away from someone else's trouble. He met her gaze steadily, and I did not expect that the girl from that morning would become the woman who rode out alone to question my treatment, knowing it might make enemies of the very people who believed they controlled this house, he answered. If there is any reason my heart still remembers how to keep going, it is because you keep refusing to let comfort or fear decide for you. They stood there for a moment in a shared quiet that did not need to be filled. The fire in the small grate crackled softly, and the last of the daylight slipped away. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour, marking another piece of time that they had both once assumed he would not see. Evelyn reached out and rested her hand lightly on the back of the chair near his, close enough that he could feel her presence without mistaking it for pity. Whatever comes next, she said, we will face it as we have faced everything else here, with our eyes open. Adrian nodded, the simple gesture carrying more weight than any elaborate vow. Together, he said. In the quiet that followed, Blackwood Manor no longer felt like a place waiting for its master to disappear. It felt, at last, like a house that might one day remember this season not as the time when sickness ruled, but as the moment when two people who had every reason to give up chose, instead, to stand their ground side by side.